In the summer of 1953, a 37-year-old man crossed the border from Iraq into Iran. He was hiding in the back seat of a Bic, covered with blankets, sweating in the heat. His name was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of an American president, agent of the Central Intelligence Agency. And in the trunk of that car, 2 suitcases. One filled with clothes. One filled with $1 million in cash. 030. His mission: remove a democratically elected prime minister. His target: a 70-year-old lawyer named Mohammad Mossadegh. The man they called the old man in pajamas. But here's what Kermit didn't know when he crossed that border. Mossadegh already knew he was coming. Iranian intelligence had intercepted communications. They knew about the money. They knew about the plan. They knew that a coup was being prepared. And still, the coup succeeded. How? How does a superpower, with all its money and all its secrets, fail to stop a plot that it knows is coming? The answer is not what you expect. The answer is not about weapons or soldiers or spies. The answer is about something much simpler and much darker. This is Chronicle Arcanum. This is the story of the coup that didn't just change one country. It changed the rules of the game for the entire world. And it started with an old man in pajamas. To understand why Mossadegh had to be destroyed, you first have to understand what he was. Mohammad Mossadegh was born in 1882 in Tehran. His father was Iran's Minister of Finance. His mother was a princess of the Qajar dynasty. He grew up inside the corridors of Persian power. He was also, from a very young age, allergic to it. He watched foreign powers treat Iran like a piece of furniture to be moved around a room. The British, the Russians, later the Americans. They arrived. They negotiated. They left with oil contracts, railway concessions, telegraph rights, and banking licenses. Iran got royalties. Minimal ones. Often unpaid. Always controlled by someone else's accounting department. Mossadegh studied law in Paris. Then in Lausanne, he earned his doctorate. He returned to Iran in 1914 with a very clear idea about what his country needed. Sovereignty. Not symbolic sovereignty. Not the kind of independence that exists on paper while foreign companies run your economy. Real sovereignty. The kind where you actually control what happens inside your own borders. He entered politics. Served as finance minister. As foreign minister. As governor of multiple provinces. He was not a radical. He was not a communist. He was, by every measure, a conservative nationalist in the tradition of European liberal democracy. He believed in parliament, in elections, in the rule of law. He also believed that a country's natural resources belong to its people. And in 1951, that belief put him on a collision course with the British Empire. In 1901, a British businessman named William Darcy paid £40,000 and some shares to the Persian government. In exchange, he received a 60-year concession to explore and extract oil across 5/6 of Iran's territory. 7 years later, they found it. The largest oil reserves are in the Middle East. The first major oil discovery in the region. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was formed, later renamed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Eventually, it was renamed again to something you definitely know: British Petroleum, BP. From 1908 to 1951, this company extracted Iranian oil, refined it at the massive Abadan refinery, and sold it to the world. The profits were extraordinary. In 1950 alone, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company made more profit from Iranian oil than it had paid Iran in royalties over the previous 50 years combined. Let that land. 1 year of profits. More than 50 years of payments. Combined, Iran got 16% of the oil revenues. In some years, less. The books were never independently audited. When Iranian officials asked to see the accounting, they were refused. The workers at Abadan, Iranian workers, in their own country, extracting their own oil, lived in segregated neighborhoods. The British staff had swimming pools and clubs. The Iranians lived in conditions that international observers described as significantly below colonial standards. And in the British Parliament, when someone suggested that perhaps Iran deserved a slightly better deal, Winston Churchill stood up and said that to give Iran a 50-50 split like the Americans had given Saudi Arabia would be a betrayal of British interests. Churchill, who would play a central role in what comes next. By 1951, every political party in Iran, nationalist, communist, religious, secular, agreed on exactly one thing: the oil needed to come home. Chapter 3, Time Magazine Man of the Year. 7 o'clock. On March 7, 1951, the Iranian Prime Minister, who opposed oil nationalization, was assassinated on the steps of a mosque. 2 weeks later, the Majlis, the Iranian parliament, voted unanimously to nationalize the oil industry. On April 28, 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh became Prime Minister of Iran. He was 69 years old. He was also, at that moment, arguably the most popular politician in the Middle East. Crowds filled the streets of Tehran. People wept with joy. The feeling was not just about oil. It was about something larger. The feeling that, for the first time in living memory, Iran was going to make a decision about its own future. That the answer to a British refusal was not another concession. Not another negotiation conducted from a position of weakness. The answer was, this is ours. It was always ours. We want it back. Mossadegh traveled to New York in October 1951 to defend Iran's case before the United Nations Security Council. He was 70 years old. He was known to suffer from ill health. He frequently conducted business from bed, received foreign dignitaries in his pajamas, and was prone to weeping in public, which the Western press found baffling and which his supporters found deeply human. At the United Nations, he gave a speech that stunned the chamber. He laid out, document by document, the history of British oil extraction in Iran. The profits taken. The royalties withheld. The audits refused. The workers treated as less than human in their own country. And he made a simple argument. The moral aspect of oil nationalization, he said, is more important than its economic aspect. This was not about money. This was about whether a country has the right to govern itself. On his way home from New York, he stopped in Cairo. Thousands of Egyptians filled the streets to cheer for him. He was seen as something unprecedented, a leader from the developing world who had stood before the great powers and said, no. In January 1952, Time magazine named Mohammad Mossadegh its Man of the Year. In London, they were furious. In Washington, they were watching very carefully. The British response to nationalization was immediate and furious. They called it theft. They called it illegal. They called it communist. They took Iran to the International Court of Justice. The court ruled it had no jurisdiction. Britain lost. They took Iran to the United Nations Security Council. Mossadegh gave his speech. The council largely sympathized with Iran. Britain lost again. So they did what empires do when they can't win legally. They organized an embargo. British warships patrolled the Persian Gulf, turning away tankers that tried to buy Iranian oil. The Abadan refinery, the largest in the world at the time, sat idle. The British technicians had been expelled. Iran had the oil, the refinery, the infrastructure. What it didn't have was buyers. Britain had quietly informed every major oil company in the world that anyone who bought Iranian oil would be shut out of every other British oil deal globally. The embargo was devastating. Iran's oil revenues collapsed from 242 million barrels in 1950 to 10 million barrels in 1952. The economy contracted. The government ran out of money. Mossadegh couldn't pay the civil service. He couldn't fund the hospitals. He couldn't maintain the roads. Britain was patient. They believed the economic pressure would eventually force Mossadegh out. A desperate population would turn against him. A new prime minister would come to power, tear up the nationalization, restore the AIOC. There was only one problem. Mossadegh didn't break. And neither did the Iranian people. The British went to Washington. Their pitch was simple. Mossadegh is a communist. Iran is falling to the Soviets. If you don't help us remove him, Russia will have the oil fields. President Truman didn't buy it. Truman had actually been sympathetic to Mossadegh. He'd sent his own negotiators to Tehran to try to broker a deal. He found the British position unreasonable. He believed in the right of countries to nationalize their own industries. But in January 1953, a new president was inaugurated. Dwight D. Eisenhower. And Eisenhower listened to the Dulles brothers. John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State. Allen Dulles was the director of the CIA. They were brothers. And they shared a particular vision of the world. Before entering government, both had worked at Sullivan and Cromwell, one of the most powerful law firms in New York. Their clients included multinational corporations with interests across the developing world. They understood, in a very practical way, how the global economic order was structured. Their view of communism was not entirely ideological. It was also commercial. Any government that nationalized foreign assets was a threat. Not just because of ideology, but because it set a precedent. If Iran could take back its oil from the British, what would stop Egypt from taking back the Suez Canal? What would stop Guatemala from taking back the banana plantations of the United Fruit Company? The precedent of successful nationalization was, to the Dulles brothers, more dangerous than any actual communist. And Mossadegh was providing that precedent. Winning in court. Winning at the UN, winning in the court of global opinion. He had to be stopped. The British came to the new administration with their plan. They called it Operation Boot. The CIA adopted it. They called it Operation Ajax. Formerly, TPAX. The budget was approved in early April 1953. $1 million to begin, with more available as needed. Eisenhower was briefed verbally. No memos. No paper trail. No meeting minutes. He kept his distance in a way that would become the template for American covert operations for the next several decades. He was informed. He approved. He left no fingerprints. The man sent to execute the plan was Kermit Roosevelt Jr. Chapter 6. Kermit. 1615. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of man the CIA liked to send into impossible situations. He was charming. Spoke fluent Persian. Had spent years traveling in the Middle East. Could blend into settings that most Americans couldn't navigate. He was also the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, which gave him a certain comfort with imperial thinking. The idea that a great power had not just the right but the obligation to shape the governments of smaller nations. He arrived in Tehran in the summer of 1953, crossing the border from Iraq in the back seat of a car, hidden under blankets. His instructions were simple. Destroy Mossadegh's government. His tools were money, disinformation, and the psychology of crowds. He paid newspaper editors to print stories portraying Mossadegh as a communist, as an atheist, as a threat to Islam itself. Stories designed to turn the religious establishment against a man who was, in reality, a devout Muslim and a conservative nationalist. He paid gangs from the poorer neighborhoods of Tehran, men who could be hired to demonstrate, to riot, to create the visual appearance of popular opposition. The CIA's own internal documents would later describe this as hiring thugs from athletic clubs. He organized a fake communist cell that sent threatening letters to prominent clerics, signed with Mossadegh's name. He bribed military officers, judges, politicians, members of parliament. He created, out of money and manufactured chaos, the appearance of a country turning against its prime minister. And then he hit the first wall. Mossadegh found out. Iranian intelligence intercepted communications. Mossadegh knew the CIA was in the country. He knew about the money. He knew about the plan to have the Shah sign a royal decree dismissing him as prime minister. On the night of August 15, 1953, the decree was delivered to Mossadegh's house. He refused to accept it. He arrested the officer who brought it. He announced to the Iranian public that a foreign-backed coup had been attempted. The Shah, learning that the operation had been exposed, panicked. He flew to Baghdad, then to Rome. The Shah of Iran was hiding in a hotel room in Rome while Kermit Roosevelt was trying to figure out what to do next. CIA headquarters in Washington sent a message. Stand down. Operation is over. Come home. Roosevelt did not come home. He had $1 million, a city full of people on his payroll, and a conviction that 3 more days was all he needed. He was right. For 4 days, Tehran was in chaos. pro-Mossadegh demonstrators filled the streets. Statues of the Shah were pulled down. The Tud Party, the Iranian communists, came out in force, which was exactly what Roosevelt needed. Because now there were actual communists in the streets. On the morning of August 19, 1953, everything moved at once. Roosevelt's paid gowns poured out of South Tehran. This time, they weren't chanting against the Shah. They were chanting for him. Carrying pictures of the Shah. Performing the visual theater of a loyalist uprising. Military units whose commanders had been bribed moved to key positions around the city. Radio stations. Government buildings. The Prime Minister's residence. The Iranian army, which Mossadegh had believed was loyal to him, began to move against his government. Tanks appeared outside his house. Mossadegh's bodyguards fought for 9 hours. Around 300 people died in the streets of Tehran that day. By evening, the resistance collapsed. Mossadegh escaped over the back wall of his house. He turned himself in the next day. Kermit Roosevelt sent a cable to Washington. Operation Arjux was complete. The Shah flew back from Rome. He was 24 hours from having been permanently deposed. From having become a historical footnote. A king who fled to Rome and never returned. Instead, he landed in Tehran as a conqueror. And as his reward for cooperating with Operation Arjux, for signing those decrees at the last moment, the United States gave him 40% of Iran's oil fields. The British, who had started this entire process to protect their oil monopoly, ended up with 40% as well. 5 American oil companies split the rest. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the company that had sparked the entire crisis, was renamed British Petroleum, BP. Mossadegh was tried in a military tribunal. Charged with treason against a king he had served his entire career. He was sentenced to death. The Shah, in one of the few merciful decisions of his reign, commuted the sentence. 3 years in military prison. Then house arrest. For the rest of his life. Mohammad Mossadegh died in 1967, in the house where they confined him, 14 years after the coup. He was 84 years old. He had spent the last 14 years of his life as a prisoner in his own home. In the country he had tried to free. His last words, according to those who were with him, were about oil. About how, one day, it would belong to the Iranian people. He didn't live to see what happened instead. With Mossadegh gone, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi consolidated power at a speed that alarmed even some of his American patrons. The CIA helped him build it. The secret police force. The internal surveillance apparatus. The detention centers. They called it SAVAK. The Organization of National Security and Intelligence. SAVAK became one of the most feared secret police forces in the world. By the 1970s, Amnesty International reported that Iran had more political prisoners per capita than any other country on earth. The torture techniques were systematic, documented, taught, in some cases, by American and Israeli intelligence officers. People disappeared. Families received no information. Lawyers were not permitted. And yet, to Washington, the Shah was a model ally. Pro-Western. Anti-Soviet. willing to sell oil at favorable prices, willing to buy American weapons. 40% of Iran's arms imports came from the United States. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter attended a New Year's Eve dinner with the Shah in Tehran. He raised his glass and offered a toast. He called Iran, under the Shah, an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world. 14 months later, the Shah was in exile, and the American embassy in Tehran was occupied. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 is taught in Western textbooks as something that emerged suddenly, inexplicably, as if the Iranian people simply decided, one day, to turn their country into a theocracy. That is not what happened. What happened was 26 years of accumulated fury. 26 years of a government that tortured its citizens with American-supplied equipment while American presidents toasted to stability. 26 years of watching the oil money flow through a royal family and their connected elite while ordinary Iranians stayed poor. 26 years of knowing that their democracy had been taken from them by a foreign power. That the man their parents had cheered for in the streets had been dragged away in pajamas so that an oil company could keep its profits. That knowledge did not fade. It calcified. It became the foundation of how a generation of Iranians understood the world. America was not a friend. America was the country that destroyed your democracy when your democracy threatened its oil interests. When Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile in Paris in February 1979, he was not just offering religion. He was offering an identity built around that knowledge. A politics organized around the certainty that the West was the enemy. And millions of people who had lived under SAVAK, whose fathers had been tortured in cells built with CIA assistance, looked at that offer and found it made complete sense. The hostage crisis was not random. The students who stormed the American embassy specifically chose the embassy because of 1953. Because they believed, correctly, that the CIA had used the embassy as its operational base for Operation Arjux. They called the embassy the den of spies. They were not wrong. 52 Americans were held for 444 days. The crisis destroyed Jimmy Carter's presidency. It defined America's relationship with Iran for the next half-century. And it began because a CIA agent arrived in Tehran in 1953 with 2 suitcases. Here is something that is almost never taught alongside the story of the 1953 coup. The very next year, 1954, the CIA ran the same operation in Guatemala. A democratically elected president named Jacobo Arbenz had nationalized land owned by the United Fruit Company, the American agricultural giant that controlled much of Guatemala's economy. The Dulles brothers again. Allen at the CIA, John Foster at State. United Fruit Company was, by coincidence, a client of their old law firm. The operation was called PB Success. The template was Arjux. Arbenz was overthrown. A military dictatorship took his place. Guatemala entered 40 years of civil war that killed 200,000 people. The precedent was now established. The CIA could overthrow governments. It was cheap. It was deniable. It worked. Over the following decades, the playbook was used in Congo, in Chile, in Indonesia, in the Dominican Republic, in Brazil, in a dozen other countries where a government made a decision that conflicted with American corporate or strategic interests. Each time, the same logic. Communist threat. Stability requirements. Vital interests. Each time, the same mechanics. Money. Disinformation. Manufactured chaos. Military support. Each time, the same aftermath. A dictatorship. Torture. Decades of instability. Populations that learn to see America not as a champion of democracy but as its most sophisticated enemy. The CIA itself described Operation Ajax as an extraordinary success. Overnight, the agency became central to American foreign policy. Covert action became, in the CIA's own words, a cheap and effective way to shape the course of world events. They were right that it was cheap. They were wrong that it was effective. Because the costs were paid by someone else. By the Iranians. The Guatemalans. The Chileans. The Congolese. And eventually, on September 11, 2001, by Americans themselves, in an attack carried out by men whose hatred of the United States had been constructed, over decades, from exactly these kinds of operations. The chickens, as someone once said, came home to roost. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. left Tehran shortly after the coup. He was celebrated inside the CIA as a hero. The agent who, against orders from headquarters, refused to stand down and delivered one of the agency's greatest early victories. He worked for the CIA until 1958. Then he became a lobbyist. Among his clients was the government of Iran. The government he had installed. He spent his later years consulting for oil companies and Middle Eastern governments. He wrote a book about the coup, a self-congratulatory memoir called Counter-Coup, published in 1979, the same year the revolution he helped make inevitable finally arrived. He died in 2000. Comfortable. Wealthy. Never prosecuted. Never even officially acknowledged by the United States government as having done anything wrong. The CIA didn't formally acknowledge its role in the coup until 2013. 60 years after an old man was dragged from his house in pajamas. The Islamic Republic of Iran that emerged from the 1979 revolution was not, in any meaningful sense, what the revolutionaries had fought for. Many of those who took to the streets against the Shah were students, intellectuals, leftists, feminists, and secular nationalists. They wanted the end of the monarchy. They wanted democracy. What they got was Khomeini. The consolidation of clerical power after 1979 was rapid and often brutal. Opposition was suppressed. Many of the revolution's secular leaders were imprisoned or executed. The Iran-Iraq War, which began in 1980 and lasted 8 years, killed hundreds of thousands. Iraq, in that war, was backed by the United States and supplied with intelligence that included the locations of Iranian forces when Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons. Iran has been under international sanctions for most of the past 45 years. Its economy has been systematically strangled. And through all of it, the revolution, the war, the sanctions, the internal repression, the Iranian government has maintained one consistent narrative that resonates deeply with the Iranian population. The West destroyed our democracy. They have the documents to prove it. On August 19, 2013, exactly 60 years after the coup, the CIA released a declassified internal report. The report, written in 1954, was blunt. It described, in the agency's own words, how Operation Arjux had been organized, how the riots were manufactured, how the press was bribed, how the military was corrupted, how a democratically elected government was destroyed to protect oil interests. The New York Times published extensive excerpts. The American government issued a statement acknowledging the CIA's role. There was no apology. There was no reparation. There was no acknowledgement of what the coup had produced, of the SAVAK torture chambers, of the revolution, of the hostage crisis, of the decades of enmity between the United States and Iran that have shaped the entire Middle East. There was a document release and a statement that said, "This happened." Nothing more. In Tehran, the reaction was muted. The Iranians already knew. They had always known. Mohammad Mossadegh asked a simple question. Why should a country's natural resources not belong to its people? It was not a radical question. It was not a communist question. It is, in fact, the question that most people in the world would answer the same way. Of course, a country's resources should belong to its people. But Mossadegh asked it at the wrong moment. In a world where the wrong answer to that question, from the perspective of the people who controlled the resources, could end your government. So they ended his government. And the answer to his question, the real answer, the one written in consequences rather than words, was this. Your resources belong to you when you are strong enough to keep them. And when you are not strong enough, they belong to whoever gets there first. That answer has not changed. It is still being written. In sanctions and proxy wars and pipeline routes and arms deals, and the specific geography of which countries get called stable and which ones get called threats. Somewhere in Tehran there is a grave. Not elaborate. Not famous. Mossadegh requested a simple burial, close to the students who were killed protesting the coup that removed him. Iranians still visit it. Not many tourists. Not much attention from the outside world. Just Iranians. Knowing what was taken. Knowing why. And knowing, perhaps, that the question has still not been answered. The old man in pajamas is still waiting. If you want to understand why the world is the way it is, not the version they teach in school, but the real version, hit subscribe. Because we're just getting started. Next time, we're going to look at another country where the CIA left its fingerprints. And trust me, you won't believe where. This has been Chronicle Arcanum. The past is not behind us. It is the question we are still refusing to answer.